I can drop a name, right? This is not from AI, it's from cooking. For a number of years, my wife and I lived near Julia Child. I guess like for 10 years. And one of the things she used to say, not to us personally, we met her once, but anyway, was you should never apologize.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You know, if you drop the roast on the floor, which she did a lot actually, or overcooked it or under, you know, it doesn't matter. It's just you serve it and don't apologize. This title, so I've given lots of talks with titles like Some Random Thoughts on, that's because I had no idea when I was asked to give a title what I was actually going to talk about. So, okay. So the title is like meaningless as far as I can tell. Oh, no, right. You've got the clicker.
Yeah.
I was going to accuse you of. So I'm going to talk. One other thing I should say, I was a complete innocent about the laser talks. So I had no picture in my mind of the audience, I must say. And so, I don't know. So I'm going to talk at a rather general level about artificial intelligence, the way I see it, and then kind of segue into a little bit of talk about natural language processing. Anyway. Okay, so AI is a young discipline, right? It's like, I mean, you know, there are kind of, happily no one argues much about when it started. My view is 1956, so it's younger than I am. And from the very beginning, there have been at least two, I will say, big methodological dimensions along which, and this is now really quite abstract, right? Along which people's work can be placed, okay? And they're independent dimensions, kind of. So, a number of people saw, a number of the founders saw, and people still now do see, AI as another way of doing cognitive science. That is, roughly speaking, the science of typically human cognition. How do people do the amazing things they do? Especially the amazing, I'll say, cognitive things they do, but also perceptual, and to some extent, much less extent, the amazing motor things they do. We'll find out, I guess, a bit about that maybe in the last talk, I don't know. And other people have said, yeah, I guess maybe that's interesting. But really what we want to do, what people in AI want to do, should want to do, forget the should, do want to do, is produce artificial systems, artifacts in a general sense, that, as it were, display intelligence in various ways. And maybe we can get some insight into how to build such systems from cognitive science, but maybe not, and who cares? Okay, so that's one. So those are people, and that's me, I'm one of those, right? So I think of AI as, in the first instance, a design discipline, where what I mean by that is you're making stuff up. You're building stuff that, you know, using whatever science you know, but you're building new kinds of stuff and not trying necessarily to find out how existing things, like me, actually, or like you, do what they do, right? Okay, so that. There's another one, so there's another dimension, and this again goes back really to the founding. I mean, it's right there at the founding fathers, and they were all fathers, by the way. Was, well, okay, you should think about artificial intelligence. I mean, what existing science, what existing techniques should you bring to it, first and foremost, okay? And there were one group of people who said, I know, we should bring kind of, broadly speaking, logical techniques. Right? Because what we want to figure out, let's go back to, you know, cognition. We're mostly interested in cognition in some sense, okay? So that's got to do with, like, thinking. And logic is about thinking, right? So we should bring logic to bear, okay? That was one group. And there was another group that said, nah, yeah, it's about thinking, all right, but really, it's not, but the way people think, people don't think logically. They don't think in conformity with the rules of logic. They think rather in conformity with a kind of loosey-goosey, typically qualitative probabilities. That's the right way to think. So don't think about probabilities with all these fancy real numbers. Think about it more qualitatively. That's a better way to model how people think, even if you're not interested in exactly how people think, but you're interested in emulating the achievements of people who think. Then approach that task not using, strictly speaking, logical techniques, okay? So those are two kind of big dimensions along which people have really differed. So human beings display lots of cognitive achievements. Lots of them we share with our non-human brethren. Anyway, lots of them we share with other critters, right? There are lots of especially sensory motor achievements, kind of getting around in the universe using our senses, that we share to some enormous extent with non-human critters of various sorts, okay? But again, for a kind of, I'll say, accidental reasons maybe, at the founding of AI, there was this focus on distinctively human cognitive achievements, or at least plausibly distinctively human. So I'm not going to get, I don't know whether dolphins speak to one another. I have no idea. Or whales. But one thing I do know is that humans, at least, are language-using critters. We may not be the only ones on the planet, but we certainly are among those. So let's look at the use of language, okay, as absolutely central, if not absolutely distinctive, human cognitive achievement, okay? So from very early on, people in AI have thought about the use of natural languages, okay? And by natural languages, by the way, all that's meant is the kinds of languages that normal human children learn as their first language. That's all it means. So English is one of them. Happens to be the only one I ever learned, as it works out. But anyway. Okay? So again, you get this dimension, that first dimension. Well, should we be interested in how people actually do it? Is that really the focus of the research, or not? And as it works out, there are some people in the world, I'm not one of them, who know something about how people actually do it, at least do some of it, where it is using language. But I'm not, as I say, I'm not one of them. So it's good that I should not think about doing it that way. Anyway, now, I thought as a matter of kind of being a good citizen, as it were, I should note that from the very beginning, far and away the biggest funder of research in artificial intelligence, and indeed in computer science quite generally, has been our government. That is, the US government. That's actually important to keep in mind, I think, for a variety of reasons, including to push back against certain people who think the government just gets in the way of innovation. Without the government, there wouldn't have been any innovation, or very little in this field, I think. So, the government, in particular, the Department of Defense's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has been by far the single biggest funder of research in artificial intelligence, including in natural language processing. And a couple of years ago, oops, I'm looking at the right hand. They started this big program called the Machine Reading Program. And the goal of that program was extremely ambitious. I should say this is built into DARPA's, as they say, DNA. The kind of high-level goals of their programs are extraordinarily ambitious. And of course, they're so ambitious that there's no chance of you're actually meeting those goals in the amount of time, which is finite in every case, that they give you, and with the amount of money, which can be quite large actually, but still finite, that they give you. What DARPA really wants to do is to give a kind of qualitative push to research in certain areas that wouldn't have been forthcoming without them. That's their picture. So I think, it's important, I think, to keep this kind of stuff in mind. So anyway, okay. So what the goal was is it was based on the following very simple premise. There's an enormous amount of useful information and knowledge that's just in written text. In particular, let's just pick one language, in English. Okay? Just an enormous amount of information, also misinformation and disinformation, but still, just an enormous amount of intellect, of stuff. I'm going to call it content, expressed in English texts, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, there are now, and promise to be even more in the future, really quite capable artificial reasoning systems. Systems that can do interesting things with content. But there's this gap between the content that's expressed in English texts, on the one hand, and these formal systems that can do stuff with content, on the other. Okay? And that gap can be filled in like a couple of ways. I'll say as if a little kind of glibly, there are two ways. One is to have people who understand English on the one hand and understand those formal reasoning systems on the other, just by hand translate from the English into the formal languages required by those formal systems. That's one way to do it. That's the impossible way. That is, you could do it, but it is not, as they would say, terribly scalable. Right? Okay, so that's just not a good idea. The other way is to have machines do it. That is, have machines that can read English well enough. And this is, by the way, I should note, this is not reading translations of the Inferno. This is basically aimed at reading, I'll say, newspaper articles. Okay? Okay. So get machines, build artificial systems, artificially intelligent systems that can read newspaper articles and other things too, maybe scientific articles in English again. Let's say, just the English isn't important here, but just to separate out certain other issues. All right, so just take one language, mine, right? Translate what's in those articles, or translate the articles, if you like, into this array of formal systems which people in AI and other parts of computer science, like for instance database people, have built, so that then all these smart processes, these smart reasoning, thinking processes that were meant for those formal, that are embodied in those formal systems, can actually work on the content that's in the English. Okay, that's the goal, right? Okay, that's what that says actually. Okay, and of course remember, this is the DoD. This is DARPA in particular. The notion they have in mind, the kind of case they have in mind, just think of it as intelligence analysts. They actually need, nothing built into the system was focused literally on the needs of intelligence analysts. This was all unclassified research, and hence we never knew what the intelligence analysts were really interested in. Right? But that's okay. Notionally, right, you have these intelligence analysts, and there's all this text out there that they can't possibly read. There's too much. That's right. And they have some reasoning systems, oftentimes database systems, and they would like to get the stuff from here into there. That's the goal, okay? That was the goal of the project. Okay, now, so I've said we're going to do this, or at least I'm going to do, the group that I led is going to do this, not caring about how people do it. I actually don't think anybody knows enough, by the way. So although I've said I'm not at all an expert on literally the cognitive science of, let's say, reading, I do believe that we simply don't know enough so that you could design a system based on what is now known about how people read and understand text. Okay? So, boom. Okay. But still, how about this other big dimension of difference? Should we use logic, right? And linguistics, that is the science of language, of, again, natural languages like English and French even? Or should we use machine learning techniques, which really means using a lot of data that's out there, freely, more or less freely available, and trying to learn how to read from the data? Okay? So that's this big, that's that other dimension, now applied to this particular case. And what does this really mean in the machine reading case? Well, if you're going to do it by thinking of it as applied linguistics and logic, you're going to end up building by hand grammars, which are just sets of rules that govern the bits and pieces of language, how you stick them together to get sentences, maybe even more than that, how you stick sentences together to get meaningful, coherent narratives, right? And then you have to do more. You have to figure out how to take those linguistic structures and express in some other language, some formal language, inspired by logicians probably, what the content of those linguistic structures is. Okay? That's one picture. That's what's come to be known as good old-fashioned AI. GoFi, is it, right? The other picture is really, in one sense, it's an old picture, in one sense. In terms of its feasibility, it's a new picture, right? It really comes out of the very late 80s, really early 90s. And it's made possible by two big, humongous, ongoing phenomena. One is Moore's Law, which everybody in this valley should know about. It essentially means computers are, for a given dollar, you just get more bang for the buck, computing-wise. That's really what it means, okay? That's one. And the other one is the availability, is the World Wide Web, really. That is the availability for free of enormous quantities of data of various kinds. Okay? Put those two together, you get this revolution that says, we're not going to have to build these systems by hand. We will have to build something. What we will build is a machine learning device which can take all this data plus a task. You have to tell it what you want what you want to be done, and this machine learning system will build another system. It'll build a machine reading system. If you give it the right kind of data and the right task objective, it will actually build another device, namely a machine reading device. It still takes a lot of human smarts and effort, but it's a very different kind of human smarts and effort. And if it works right, you can do it much quicker and cheaper than by having a lot of PhDs write a lot of rules by hand. Okay? That's the picture. I won't go through any of this thing. So, okay, so here are these two ways of doing things, right? And of course the right answer, as Hegel would have told us, is a synthesis of the two. That is, as it works out, the pure machine learning, at least as I understand, the pure machine learning approach, which makes a lot of sense for a lot of tasks, just won't work for this task by it. I mean, it won't work in its kind of pure form. What you really need is a kind of synthesis of a logical approach and a machine learning approach. And that was that's been the focus of especially the group that I am proud to lead. Anyway, that's been our focus for the last 5+ years. So this is a very new way of thinking about things. I mean, by very new, I mean the first inklings go back to the late 90s. That's relatively new, right? And I think of it, as I say, in terms of this kind of like fake arithmetic. I think of this as like fake algebra, really, you know. So it's a probabilistic representation of a bunch of information on the one hand, plus state-of-the-art, statistically trained machine learning modules. And you want to put all those together, right? And get something. And the question is how to operationalize that plus. That's really to me, that's arguably the single most important research issue in all of AI. How to operationalize that plus. Okay? And there are lots of different possibilities. I'm not going to explain. I mean, I'll be glad to answer questions, but I'm not going to say anything about them now. And this is just this enormous problem. And of course, there's so little time and there's almost never enough money. But that's what we're doing. And I think that's the last slide.
Questions?
A minute or two for questions.
Yeah.
Should I? Yeah.
So